Hi, I wanted to talk about the registration and reporting requirements for lobbyists in the state of California. California's Political Reform Act of 1974, the PRA, is contained in the California Government Code, and Chapter 6 of Article 1 discusses registration and reporting. Section 86-100 of the California Government Code requires the following entities to register with the Secretary of State: lobbying firms, lobbyist employers who employ one or more lobbyists, lobbying coalitions who employ at least one in-house lobbyist, and then each individual lobbyist is required to submit a lobbyist certification for filing with the Secretary of State as part of the registration of the lobbying firm in which that lobbyist is a partner, owner, officer, or employee. A registration statement must be filed both online or electronic means, and also physically submitting the original statement and a copy in the paper format at the Secretary of State's office. Section 86-101 specifies that every lobbying firm and lobbyist employer who's required to file a registration statement must register with the Secretary of State no later than 10 days after qualifying as a lobbying firm or lobbyist employer. Section 86-102 requires the Secretary of State to charge each lobbying firm and lobbyist employer required to file a registration statement a fee of $50 per year for each lobbyist who's required to be listed on its registration statement. Section 86-103 requires a lobbyist certification to include a recent photograph of the lobbyist's full name, business address, email address, and telephone number, a statement that the lobbyist has read and understands the prohibitions, and a statement regarding the lobbyist's completion of his or her ethics course. For a lobbyist who filed a completed lobbyist certification in connection with the last regular session of the California legislature, then the lobbyist has to file a statement that he or she has completed the ethics course within the previous 12 months, or that the lobbyist will complete the required ethics course no later than June 30th of the following year. In the case of a new lobbyist certification, if the lobbyist hasn't completed the course within the prior 12 months, then the lobbyist certification is required to include the statement that the lobbyist will complete the course within 12 months. Section 86-104 specifies that the registration of a lobbying firm has to include the full name, business address, and telephone number of the lobbying firm, a list of the lobbyists who are partners, owners, officers, or employees of the lobbying firm, and the lobbyist certification of each lobbyist in the lobbying firm. Section 86-105 of the Government Code requires the registration of a lobbyist employer that employs lobbyists or a lobbying coalition to include specified information. And the lobbyist employer or coalition is also required to provide a list of lobbyists who are employed by either the lobbyist employer or the coalition, and the lobbyist certification of each lobbyist employed. Section 86-106 requires each registered lobbying firm and lobbyist employer that'll be conducting activities to renew their registration between November 1 and December 31st of each even-numbered year. Section 86-107 provides that if any change occurs in the information in a registration statement, then the amendment must be filed both online and physically, submitting the original and one copy of that amendment with the Secretary of State within 20 days after the change has occurred. Lobbying firms and lobbyist employers during the regular session of the legislature that cease all activity must also file a notice of termination within 20 days after the cessation of activity. Section 86-108 requires the Secretary of State to make all the information listed on any lobbyist registration statements available to the public on the internet as soon as possible after their receipt. Section 86-109 provides that within 140 days after the commencement of each regular session of the legislature, that the Secretary of State is required to publish a directory of individual lobbyists, lobbying firms, and lobbyist employers. Section 86-109.5 requires the Secretary of State to establish and maintain on the internet an online listing of lobbyists, lobbying firms, and lobbyist employers. Section 86-110 states that lobbyists, lobbying firms, and lobbyist employers who receive payments or make payments or incur expenses which are connected with their lobbying activities, which are reportable. They have to keep detailed accounts, records, bills, and receipts. Section 86-111 defines the terms activity expense and agency official. And Section 86-112 requires that when a person is required to report activity expenses, that they have to provide information of those activity expenses. 86-112.3 of the Government Code provides that each person who files a report, who sends any written or printed invitations to an elected state officer, a candidate for elected office, a legislative or agency official, must include on the invitation or on the letter attached to the invitation a statement that is at least as large as 8-point Roman boldface type in a color or print that contrasts with the background so that it's easily legible. And the following statement must be included. Attendance at this event by a public official will constitute acceptance of a reportable gift. Section 86-112.5 requires each person filing a report to provide the beneficiary of a gift listed within the report, including the date and the amount, and of course, a description of the goods or services provided to that beneficiary. Section 86-113 requires a lobbyist to complete and verify a periodic report that contains all activity expenses by the lobbyist and a report of any contributions of $100 or more made or delivered by the lobbyist to any elected state officer or state candidate. And Section 86-114 requires lobbying firms to file periodic reports containing required information. Section 86-115 requires statements to be filed by lobbyist employers and any persons who directly or indirectly make payments to influence legislative or administrative actions of $5,000 or more in any calendar quarter. Section 86-116 requires that every person described as a lobbyist employer or a $5,000 or more filer have to file periodic reports that contain specified information. Section 86-116.5 requires all state and local agencies that file reports to disclose, except for their overhead expenses, all payments of $250 or more made in a reporting period related to lobbyist activities, payments of any other efforts or expenses incurred to influence or attempt to influence either legislative or administrative action, and any dues or payments made to organizations if they're equal to 10% of its total expenditures or $15,000 or more during any calendar quarter in an effort to influence legislative or administrative action. And then Section 86-117 provides that required reports are to be filed during the month following each calendar quarter. And the period covered runs from the first day of January through the last day of the calendar quarter. And finally, there's Section 86-118 of the Government Code that requires reports to be filed online or electronically with the California Secretary of State.